guys, and welcome back. So today's video is going to be very special because it's actually a sponsored video with GraphicStock, and that's something that I'm actually really excited about because it's all about textures and using textures digitally, which is something that I'm very passionate about and I love using in my work. And honestly, it's one of my favorite things to do digitally is finding new ways to incorporate textures and how to make them work for me and finding new textures because I love textures. But the format of this video, we're going to talk a little bit about GraphicStock, then we're going to go into a little bit of a tutorial on how I like to treat textures when I'm about to use them in my digital work, and then we're going to go into an actual piece where I'm using my textures. And I wanted this piece to be stylistically one that would work really well with having a very textured look to it, something that I could really dive in and do something with a lot of textures and figure that out. But yeah, let's start off talking a little bit about GraphicStock. A few things about GraphicStock is that it is a website where you can use images, textures like the ones I'm using in this, vectors, illustrations, photographs. There's tons and tons of stuff available there, over 300,000 actually, and they're all royalty free. So in case you don't know what that means, it does mean that when you use these images, they are 100% free to use. So when you use it in your pictures, you can print them out and sell them. You can monetize them in any way possible because you're not having to go back to whoever created that texture and say, okay, here's some money because I used it. So it is everything that you create with that still belongs to you. You have full rights to everything once you've used it, which is something that you need to absolutely make sure of when you're using other assets in your work, because you want to be 100% sure that what you're using belongs to you and you have the rights to it and you have the right to reproduce it and all of that stuff. So that is extremely important to be aware of when you're using textures, especially off the internet. And if you'd like to try them out, you can go to graphicstock.com/YouTube or click the link down in my description, and that'll take you to where you can get a 7-day free trial where you can try out up to 140 textures, which is a lot, and that's a lot that you can start using in your digital work. So that is very exciting. But if you're curious what I'm actually searching for, some of the terms that I looked for when I was looking for my textures are grunge, light grunge. Light grunge is really good for like an overall soft texture. I love that search term for textures. But yeah, grunge, light grunge, watercolor texture, those are all some of my favorite search terms for textures. But yeah, we can go ahead and get into the actual little tutorial on how I use them and how I incorporate them into my work. Okay, so this part is the little tutorial part where I'll show you how I just like to treat my textures and get them all prepped and ready for actually using them. And when I'm doing these steps, it's usually after I've already started the image and I put it into the image and then do these changes compared to how it looks within the piece. So I very rarely will do this to a texture and then save it and then keep it that way, because I like to be able to really tailor it exactly to how I want it for that piece. I'll explain that a little bit when I pull them up, but we can go ahead and start by bringing in the first texture, and you just go into File and select Place Embedded, and this is one of the folders that I have a lot of my textures in. And we can go with this one right here, which is a watercolor texture that I got from GraphicStock. And this one's good for kind of showing a few of the things that I do, because first off, the first thing that I almost 100% always do is I will take the color out of it, so I will completely desaturate it. So I'll just come up to Image, Adjustments, and the Hue and Saturation, and then I'll just drop this bar all the way down. And the reason that I prefer to do it this way is I'll usually put it down and see if I like how the colors affect the piece, but most of the time I prefer to keep control over all the colors so that it's the colors that I am choosing and putting down, rather than having the textures affect them in a way that I'm not really anticipating or planning on. So this is a great way to just give it texture without manipulating the color beyond what I actually want it to do. So I will take the saturation and drop it all the way down so there's no more color, it's only black and white. And then a lot of times I'd like to come in and do another thing where I go to Adjustments and then I click on Brightness and Contrast, and I just like to play around with this depending on how I'm using the piece or this particular texture. But for this, I'll bring up the brightness so it's overall much lighter, and I also usually like to bring up contrast quite a bit too. The reason that I like that is because you really get a lot more impact from the textures when you have much higher highs and much lower lows, and that's where the gritty texture comes rather than it being pretty mid-tone throughout, so I like to bump the contrast up as much as I like how it looks. It all depends on how it looks and how it fits with the actual piece. So normally I'd have a piece that I'm working on behind here that I've already placed this down, and then I can see how it's interacting with my line work and the colors and everything. But for now, this is the steps that I take. Okay, and another thing that I really like to be able to do is that a lot of textures have really interesting groups of values, so especially like right here where it's really dark and then it's lighter around it. But a lot of times those really dark spots, once you put it into the piece, are a lot more distracting and they make you look at it. So a lot of times I'd like to be able to come in here and then knock those down so that they are not nearly as dark and it doesn't make your eye go to it immediately like it does right now. So I like to come in and take the clone stamp tool, which is right here, and I use a really textured brush already, and Photoshop has a ton of already textured brushes that are default, so you have a lot of options for that are already there. But if it's textured already, it just helps it all blend in. But you take that and then you use the Alt key and you hold that down and select somewhere else within the texture, somewhere that you want to emulate that same kind of texture there. So you just hold Alt, click on it, and then it marks that that's where it's gonna copy it. So you can see there that it's still showing that same patch. And I also have a brush that has the opacity set so that the pen pressure controls that. That way I can really build up how I cover it, and then I can blend it out into the texture around it. So yeah, it's just a really good way to help it get exactly the way that I want it, to make sure that the values are where I want it to be, and make sure that nothing is overly distracting or overly contrasted compared to the piece that it's trying to fit into. And a lot of times for textures like this, I like to specifically use them if I have an area that I want there to be a lot of texture. So in the piece that I'm about to show you, there's an area where her dress kind of swoops down, and I like using really contrasted textures for areas where it would work really well if it were already grunged up in real life. If that dress were real, it could have this kind of a texture to it. So I really like using that to put in a little bit more of the subject matter. So the subject matter interacts with something highly textured like this, whereas textures that maybe are mostly this top area where it's much more soft and mid-tone, that works really well for just giving texture overall to the full piece. Okay, so now we can get into the actual piece that we've been working on. So I've done the inking and the sketching and the color blocking in another video. That way in this one I can just focus on figuring out the colors and the textures and making them kind of mesh together and finding a good way to bring the textures into my digital work. So we're going to focus on that on this one. But when I started, I actually usually like to incorporate textures after I have done all the line work, all the coloring. For the most part, I've figured out the colors or the direction of the colors that I want to go in. And I actually used to go in first with just putting a texture down on the empty canvas and then working up from that. And I've actually started shying away from that a little bit because I like being able to have my idea down first and then put down the texture that best fits that, and I can manipulate it in a way that it fits what I've already put down and it works with the shapes that I've created. Whereas I feel like when I started off with the texture, a lot of times I kind of felt a little bit held back by it, like I was subconsciously following some of the areas there, and basically I like to go in when I already have an idea, but I still have work to do. So here I have the basic colors down, I have the idea of where I want to go with it, but I'm not 100% nailed down on every single color, and a lot of times, all the time, I like to go in and add some color variation into all of the shapes. So like the masks, I had a little bit more blue on one area and blended it out to the base color, and I hadn't done that yet. I just wanted to be able to have a good clear direction of where I wanted to go with it, and then I added the textures on top of that, and within that way I could really incorporate the two and make sure that my idea was coming first and the textures were only supporting it afterwards. And one thing that I was really excited about putting into action with the textures in this piece is I really wanted to show the depth and the different layering that I had happening in this piece. So I have the background, which is that empty space and the curtains. And then I have the midground, which is that second character, and then I have the foreground, which is the first character. And I really, really wanted to be able to push that depth that was happening there and make it stand out a little bit more. And I could do that with the texture. So what I did was I made sure that the very background had the most layering of texture. So I ended up using multiple actual texture layers, and then I just went and either erased them or made sure that they only filled in a certain area. But for the background I had, I believe, 3 layers of texture. And then for the second character, I had 2. So I went in with that first that kind of covered everything. And then I went in with another layer that had a nice texture that was pretty soft overall. It was pretty mid-tone. And I put that to only over that second character so that she has a little bit more of texture than the first front character, but a little bit less than the background because I erased her out of 2 of the other background textures. So the background has the most texture layering, that second character has a little bit less, and that front character has even less than that. And it kind of has this atmospheric effect where it just gets a little bit hazier and not as sharp the farther it goes back, which is kind of a representation of how actually looking into distances in real life works. So I think that it really worked well in being able to push some of the areas back and make them the way that I wanted it to. And then some of my favorite details was adding the highlighting to this piece because I really wanted their eyes to glow through and have a really ethereal, kind of creepy look to it. I especially wanted it to push the idea that they were masks and that there was something underneath that was glowing through. And I did all of that layering, all of the lighting layering on top of my textures and on top of everything else, including the line work. That way it could stand above it, it could really glow, and it wouldn't have the textures affecting the highlight. I wanted the highlight to come out clean like light. So that's just kind of something to keep in mind, is that when you're using textures, it's also really important to think about where the texture should not be just as much as where it should be. And it's just really helpful to be able to think through where you want it to be, like clothing. I really like focusing on having it in clothing or on backgrounds or environments, and some areas I like it to be much less so, like the face. I like the face to be something that's fairly clear of texture so that it's just the kind of coloring that I'm putting down and it's not really distracted by the texture itself. So that's just a good thing to keep in mind, is be wary of where you want it to be and where you also don't want it to be, because you can always erase it out, lighten the texture, even put masks over it if you want to try out taking it out a little bit. But I would just say, when it comes to incorporating textures, a big part of it for me is playing with the layer mode itself and choosing one that works with what effect I want. So things like multiply, it makes it darker, and things like overlay make it lighter, and in some cases I want it to have that brightness, and others I want it to be darker. So a big part, like I said, of using textures is just finding the right kind of mode for the exact type of piece that I'm using. So I would definitely say, if you're getting into using textures, experiment with the different layer modes and how you can incorporate that into your piece that way. But that is pretty much it for this piece. I was really excited to be able to bring in new textures into my work, because the textures that I've been using have gotten a little bit stale and I haven't gotten new ones for quite a long time now. So it's fun to have new stuff to work on and incorporate into my work. So I had a lot of fun with that, and I really love the subject matter of this one. I had a lot of fun thinking it through and thinking of ideas for it, and the overall mood and atmosphere of it being kind of mysterious is definitely something that I really enjoyed working on. But these two, this print, these girls, they'll be available on my shop. So I'll have a link right below me to my art shop itself, and then I'll have a link to the actual print of this down in my description. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you at my next video. Bye.